Brian's mom, Roberta, was sweet. She would knit a lot and she would make Gabby things, but then started getting comfortable and not treating her as nicely.
The same can likely be said for Brian. Once he got comfortable, familiarity started to breed contempt. I also think Brian's mother's dislike, perhaps even jealousy of Gabby, if that is the case, reminds one of Chris Watts' mother, feeling enmity towards Shanann. And so there's a subtle license there, I think, whenever the son has negative interactions to sort of default to the mother's default programming, which is kind of disapproval that someone isn't good enough for them, or that they are right regardless because they are the golden child. In this analysis, I want to look into 3 insights we get via the laundry family dynamics. And this has been quite hard to find out about. In Netflix's first episode, we get to see some interactions between Brian and his mother. We see disturbing texts that Gabby sent to Brian about his mother, like this one, as well as photos of Gabby with the laundries we've never seen before, like this one.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Now, before we deal with more insights from episode 1, I've noticed quite a few of you taking the position that this is a really simple, obvious story that amounts to Brian bad, Gabby good, Brian murdered Gabby, the end. And that's fine. You know, if that's your takeout, run with it, but then you're likely not to find the analysis here very worthwhile. But if you're interested in understanding the complexities and in getting to know these people, you know, to some extent behind the masks, you know, getting to know these people beyond them as one-dimensional cardboard cutouts, then fasten your seatbelts, because this Netflix series allows us to some extent to do that, and there is a lot to go through. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, meaningful, interesting, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So what we're interested is digging deeper into the human psychology and looking into more complex and subtle details. We spoke about subtlety in the previous episode on Gabby Petito, and we want to go beyond the obvious end result and simply ask quite a simple question. What is this mechanism of this dysfunction? You know, what does it look like? How does it play out? What are the patterns? And in a way, where does it come from? How does it sort of find its start and manifest? But we can only do that if we prepare to look beyond Brian's
These violent delights have violent ends.
In other words, what you want to do here is not see Brian as a random, disconnected fragment, but rather the inevitable result of a process involving not only his own programming and filters, but those that come out of family relationships and many other factors, like being a mama's boy, like being a golden child, spoiled, entitled, but also insecure and struggling with low self-esteem. So be curious and you might learn something. Now, isn't it interesting the timeline of the Gabby Petito case? In Netflix, we see the date on screen, December 2019. What does that date mean to you? Well, in terms of Gabby and Brian, they were dating for 9 whole months before Gabby even told her family they were dating. That's quite a long time. And then at the same time that she made that disclosure, she also said, guess what, we're uprooting to Florida, right? Remember I said that was a double quick sort of disclosure. And then 6 months later, after that, on July 2nd, they were engaged. That's the third fast move from Brian. And because of COVID, they had to scrap their wedding plans. And it's within this messy rush scenario that the van life thing came into being. Also kind of hinky was Gabby's mother, Nicole, only finding out about the engagement because Roberta had posted it on Facebook. So that's also a dynamic we have to bear in mind, Gabby's natural subtlety. You can say what you like about that, but it's likely Brian knew he could count on Gabby's reticence if and when he was behaving badly, which was often. And I mean, a big part of why he got away with the Moab incident was because Gabby covered for him, and I think he thought that that would happen, and he was right. You can also see there's not really a proper relationship between Brian's parents and Gabby's parents, even in a scenario of their kids becoming engaged to be married. And I mean, who would want the insular laundries as in-laws? But there's another aspect that's also worth noting. All of this sort of happened slap bang in the middle of COVID. Do you remember that? What do you notice the one officer is wearing during the Moab stop? And I remember when the whole world was locked down, wondering, I wonder what cases are going to be caused by COVID. Well, this was one. Many of us watched this case unfold at a time when the cinemas were closed, you couldn't fly anywhere, and there wasn't really anything on TV. And I do think COVID played a role in isolating this couple more than it otherwise would have been. And also pushing, in a sense, Gabby and Brian together, sort of pressuring them to stay together because you can't kind of interact as much as you normally could with people. And, you know, this was happening more than otherwise would have been the case. And I think COVID probably had a hugely suffocating impact in terms of living with the laundries and sort of not being able to see anyone else. And this is besides the anxiety, not only existential, but about the world, about how fragile it was, but also how the world could impose its will on someone who's wanting to simply be alive and live their lives. Well, okay, all right. I think I've laid down enough foundation, sufficient context for us to now drill down into the specificities. And that brings us to 3 insights into the laundry family dynamics. Number 1, jealousy.
Brian's mom was having problems with how much time Gabby and Brian were spending together. Her jealousy was definitely very odd.
Something else that was odd was this idea of Gabby leaving Long Island to go to Florida to live with Brian, but not just Brian, to live with Brian who was living with his parents. What could go wrong? Well, a lot. And we see a possible seed here for Brian's neediness, clinginess, and emotional dependence, and it's kind of through his mother, because his mother seems to still dote on her boy like he's a child. And she comes across, certainly from Nicole's version of events, as jealous of Gabby. And there are some hints of this in Gabby's text to Nicole, where she says, you know, I know I'm just nervous to walk out of the room. I feel like I did something. Now, Brian also seems to be aware of this, and Gabby is so painfully aware of this, she starts to feel awkward and starts to be on tenterhooks around Brian's mother, which leads to Brian saying, a lot of days were like this when I was growing up, and it always just blows over. Now, you may say Roberta's jealousy and wanting attention it's harmless, except we saw that it manifested in Brian in his relationship with Gabby, and was it harmless there? You know, jealousy and wanting attention. He seemed to think it was normal. It's not normal. It's about control. And often controlling parents mean there's a low self-esteem issue that manifests in a nasty way. You know, the world becomes a scary, intimidating place, which only increases anxiety, and then what? Well, the need to control the world increases commensurate with that, and controlling the world ends up being about controlling people or trying to control people. That brings us to number 2, spite. If it was just a little jealousy, I suppose that would be okay, but it wasn't a little. There was a nasty edge to it, or at least Nicole thought so. Gabby texted her mother, anyway, I didn't fed my mail, but we haven't heard from Brian's parents. I wonder if his mom changed my mail, because that's weird. Now, one thing Roberta did without telling anyone was redirect her mail back to her mother's address. That's Gabby's mother's address. And so Gabby's mother says, wait, you didn't do it? Is she going to ship that up here? She definitely hates you. Now, I know what you're thinking. Even if Roberta didn't like Gabby, so what? Well, when Gabby doesn't return with Brian, when he comes back with her van, what do you think? Is Roberta upset about that or relieved? Is she worried about Gabby or glad to be rid of her when Brian comes back without her? Because now she has her son back and all to herself. And that brings us to number 3, and this is probably the most important part, Mama's boy. Brian was definitely a mama's boy like Chris Watts and Scott Peterson. If you need some evidence of that, just have a look at the burn after reading note. We are going to deal with that at some point in more detail. But being a mama's boy can lead to an unhealthy sense of entitlement. It can lead to this sense that being possessive is normal, being controlling is normal. But it can also lead to feelings of such as a fear of abandonment and unrealistic expectations. Brian expecting Gabby not to work and be his beck and call girl is an example of unrealistic expectations. Being overly critical is also an artifact of doting parents. Sometimes too much attention ends up being unhealthy, a kind of unhealthy attentiveness, in the same way that monitoring behavior is unhealthy. I think the biggest implication in all this is that Brian likely believed that if he killed Gabby, his parents would believe any story and back him. And wasn't he right? Because he was used to them always doing that. He could do no wrong in a sense. And, if they did back him, why not everyone else? If they believed him, who was to say anyone would not believe him? Scott Peterson and Chris Watts had similar theories, that if their parents supported them, everybody else would. So do you see the mama's boy aspect, and a man who sees himself as a golden child lives on a sort of psychological pleasure island where he gets every wish fulfilled. And that is what makes breaking up with such men, mama's boy, golden child, those kind of men, so hard, because they're kind of boy men, right? They haven't fully grown up, and they're used to getting what they want, and they're not used to negotiating or being mature about anything. They know the language of control, and they're not used to not getting what they want and not being in control. And when they're not in control, they feel threatened by this. When they're not in control, this makes them feel endangered and even scared. And they then project these feelings of threat, in a way, that they're feeling onto the poor girl who's trying to get away. Food for thought. I'm not going to take it further than that, but I do think another side of the equation is, given Brian's creepy, possessive tendencies, what made Gabby attracted to him? And in the same way, I think one can go into her family and her family structure, and to what extent did dysfunction flow out of that? And if you think about it, the one side of the family is divorced, which happened at quite an early age, whereas Brian's parents are rock solid. And perhaps she was quite attracted to that idea of security, that idea of stability, that idea of a soothing family unit in a way. What do you guys think? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.